At 6:15 in the morning, someone pounded on my front door so hard I thought the house was on fire. An old instinct from 40 years as a firefighter that had me halfway into my slippers before I was even fully awake. It wasn't a fire. It was a marshal, flanked by two uniformed police officers, holding a folder of paperwork that said I no longer owned the house I had lived in for 31 years. And standing across the street in her pajamas, phone raised, laughing into the camera as I stood in my own driveway in my bathrobe with nowhere to go, was my daughter-in-law, narrating the whole thing live to her followers like it was the funniest thing she'd ever witnessed. Before I tell you what she didn't know about the man she was filming, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, and hit subscribe if you believe a house built on lies eventually collapses under its own weight. My name is Walter Hayes. I am 71 years old, and for 40 years I served in the fire department here in this county, working my way up from a rookie hauling hoses to fire chief, the man responsible for the safety of nearly 200 firefighters and, by extension, everyone in this town who ever had to dial 911 during the worst moment of their life. I started as a 19-year-old kid straight out of the academy, terrified during my first structure fire, and I spent the following 4 decades learning, call by call, year by year, exactly what it meant to stay calm when everyone around you was losing their composure. Exactly what it meant to make careful, deliberate decisions under conditions most people can't even fully imagine. I retired 6 years ago with a full pension, a chest full of commendations I never much cared to display, and a modest 3-bedroom house on Larkspur Lane that my late wife Carol and I bought in 1994, the same year our son Brian was born, paid off in full nearly a decade ago through years of careful, disciplined saving that I never once regretted, even when younger colleagues teased me for driving the same truck for 15 years, just to keep that mortgage payment low. I had built my career the same deliberate way I had built everything else in my life, never chasing recognition, never angling for promotions I hadn't earned through demonstrated competence, simply showing up, year after year, and doing the work as thoroughly and carefully as I knew how. By the time I made chief, nearly 22 years into my career, I had responded to more house fires, car accidents, and medical emergencies than I could ever fully count, and I had developed, through sheer repetition, an instinct for reading a dangerous situation quickly and accurately, an instinct that, though I never expected it, would prove just as useful reading through a stack of fraudulent legal paperwork as it had once been reading smoke patterns in a burning building. Carol passed away 4 years ago from a heart condition that gave us almost no warning at all. One difficult week between her diagnosis and the funeral that I still have trouble fully remembering in sequence. The details blurred together the way trauma sometimes blurs things, even for a man trained to stay calm under pressure. She was the one who filled that house with warmth, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who insisted every Sunday on a family dinner even during the years Brian seemed determined to put distance between himself and both of us. She had a particular gift for seeing people clearly, for sensing when something was wrong long before it became obvious. A gift I have thought about often in the months since discovering exactly how thoroughly I had been deceived by people I trusted. Since she died, the house on Larkspur Lane has been quieter than I ever imagined a house could be, though it remained, until that morning, the one constant, unshakable thing in my life, the place I always knew I would return to, no matter what else changed. My son Brian is 39 years old, a mid-level project manager at a regional construction firm, a decent, if somewhat conflict-averse man, who has spent most of his adult life, I've come to understand only recently, quietly avoiding confrontation with anyone who pushes hard enough against him. As a boy, Brian had been anxious, sensitive, more comfortable reading alone in his room than roughhousing with the neighborhood kids. And Carol had always been better than I was at meeting him exactly where he was, rather than pushing him toward the more assertive, outgoing personality I sometimes, unfairly, wished he'd developed. I loved my son deeply, but I recognize now, with the particular clarity hindsight sometimes provides, that I had never fully understood how vulnerable his conflict avoidance made him to someone determined enough to exploit it. He married Melissa Draper 5 years ago, a woman with an easy, practiced charm that I recognized, even early on, as something slightly performative, though I told myself for years that this was simply an old man's unfair suspicion of anyone new who married into the family. Melissa worked, according to what Brian told us over the years, in real estate consulting, a vague enough description that I never asked many follow-up questions. A decision I now understand was a mistake I will carry with me for a long time. I remember Carol, in one of her last conversations with me before she passed, mentioning that something about Melissa's career always seemed just slightly too vague for comfort. A small, offhand observation I hadn't thought much about again until everything unraveled years later. I want to be honest about something before this story goes any further. My relationship with Brian had grown distant over the years, not through any single dramatic falling out, but through the slow, quiet accumulation of missed calls and shortened visits that happened sometimes between a father and a son who simply stopped making the effort to close the gap between them. Carol had always been the bridge between us, the one who kept the family connected through sheer force of will, and without her, I think both Brian and I lost some of the motivation to maintain what had always, honestly, taken more effort from her than from either of us. It was a Thursday morning in late autumn when everything changed. I had been up since 5:30. The same early schedule 40 years of fire department shifts had permanently wired into my body. Sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. The same simple morning routine I'd kept since retirement. When the pounding started at the front door, sharp and insistent, the kind of knock that immediately puts a former first responder's nervous system on high alert. My body already halfway out of the chair before my mind had fully caught up to the sound. I opened the door to find a marshal, a heavy-set man in his 50s holding a clipboard, flanked by two uniformed police officers standing slightly behind him with the careful, neutral expressions officers wear when they anticipate a situation might turn emotional. The morning air was cold enough that I could see my own breath, and I remember, even in the confusion of the moment, noticing the particular quality of the light, that flat gray autumn morning light that always used to remind me of early shifts at the station, waiting for the first call of the day. "Mr. Hayes," the marshal said, glancing down at his clipboard, "I have an eviction order for this property, effective immediately. You'll need to gather any essential belongings and vacate within the hour." I stood in my own doorway, in my robe, holding a coffee cup, and felt a confusion so complete it took several seconds before I could even form a coherent response. "There must be some mistake," I told him. "I've owned this house outright for over a decade. There's no mortgage, no lien, nothing that would allow for an eviction." The marshal, to his credit, seemed genuinely uncomfortable, sliding the folder of paperwork toward me. "Sir, according to county records, this property was sold 4 months ago to a company called Meridian Property Holdings. I'm just here to execute the court order." I stood there reading through the paperwork in the gray early morning light, my hands beginning to shake slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the particular, disorienting vertigo of watching something you believed was absolutely certain reveal itself to be built on nothing at all. The same specific feeling, I realized later, that I used to see on the faces of homeowners watching their house collapse in on itself after a fire. That instant, when the mind refuses to reconcile what the eyes are seeing with what it knows should be true. And it was in that exact moment, standing in my driveway trying to make sense of documents that claimed I had sold my own house months earlier, without my knowledge, that I heard the laughter from across the street. Melissa stood on the sidewalk in front of the neighbor's yard, still in her pajamas, a cardigan thrown over her shoulders against the morning chill, phone held up at chest height, narrating to whatever audience was watching. "Oh my God, you guys, this is actually happening right now," she was saying, barely containing her laughter, panning the camera between my face and the marshal's paperwork. "I told you this was coming. I told everyone this was coming." I looked at her standing there, laughing at a 71-year-old man being told he no longer had a home, and I felt something settle into place inside me, cold and clear. The same particular calm I used to feel walking into a burning building. The part of my training that had always kicked in, exactly when panic tried to take over. The discipline of 40 years teaching my body and mind to slow down, precisely when everything around me was screaming to speed up. I noticed, standing there, a few of my neighbors beginning to emerge onto their own porches, drawn by the flashing lights of the marshal's vehicle and the 2 patrol cars, and I remember feeling, even through the fog of confusion, a distant, aching embarrassment at being seen this way. A man who had spent decades running toward other people's emergencies, now standing helplessly in his own driveway, unable to do anything but watch his own life come apart. Brian arrived 20 minutes later, having apparently been called by Melissa the moment the marshal's car pulled up. his expression a strange, unconvincing mixture of concern and something else I couldn't quite name at the time. He was still in the sweatpants he'd clearly thrown on hurriedly, his hair uncombed, and I remember thinking, even in the chaos of the moment, that he looked genuinely rattled, more rattled than someone fully aware of an orchestrated scheme would typically appear. "Dad, it's fine. I promise. This is just a misunderstanding," he said, pulling me aside while the marshal waited patiently near his car. "It's just a temporary financing arrangement. I can explain everything. Just don't make a scene right now, okay?" I looked at my son, standing in the driveway of the house he'd grown up in, asking me not to make a scene while I was being physically removed from my own home, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that whatever explanation he was about to offer would not be the whole truth. "Brian," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, "I need you to tell me right now, honestly, do you know why there's a stranger's company listed as the owner of this house?" He hesitated, just long enough that I noticed it, and told me it was complicated, that Melissa had handled most of the paperwork for some restructuring, and that he was sure it would all sort itself out once their lawyer looked into it properly. I remember studying his face carefully in that moment, the same careful, evaluative attention I'd once used sizing up a scene before committing resources to a rescue, and deciding that whatever was actually happening, my son genuinely did not seem to fully understand it himself. I did not argue with the marshal. I did not resist the two officers who, with visible reluctance, informed me I needed to gather what I could carry and leave the property. I have spent 40 years training myself to remain calm during the worst moments of other people's lives, and I found that same discipline, however strained, carrying me through what might have been the worst moment of my own. I packed a single suitcase with the same efficient economy of movement I'd once used packing emergency gear before a call, moving methodically from room to room, gathering medications, important documents I kept in a small fireproof box in the closet, a framed photograph of Carol from our wedding day, the few things that felt genuinely irreplaceable, rather than simply valuable. I remember pausing for just a moment in the doorway of what had been Brian's childhood bedroom, still faintly decorated with the fading remnants of a boy's interests from decades earlier. A few model airplanes still displayed on a shelf Carol had never had the heart to fully clear out, even after he moved away for good. I did not have time, in that hurried hour, to linger on the particular grief of that moment, but I have thought about it often since. The strange, layered sadness of losing a house while standing in the exact room where I had once tucked my son into bed every night, reading him the same 3 books until he'd memorized every word himself. I took the folder of eviction paperwork, checked one final time that I hadn't forgotten Carol's small jewelry box tucked in the back of our closet, and walked out of my own front door without another word to Brian, without a single glance toward Melissa, who was still filming, still narrating, still laughing. I checked into a modest motel on the edge of town that same morning, sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed with the eviction paperwork spread out in front of me, and I began, methodically, to read through every page. The documents claimed the property had been sold 4 months earlier to Meridian Property Holdings for a sum well below its actual market value. The transaction authorized through a power of attorney document bearing my signature, a signature I knew, with absolute certainty, I had never provided. I have signed my name enough times over 7 decades to know exactly what it looks like, and the signature on that document, while a reasonably competent forgery, carried subtle inconsistencies that immediately caught my attention. The kind of details a careful eye trained by decades of reviewing incident reports and official documentation learns to notice almost instinctively. I called an old friend that same afternoon, a retired title attorney named Eugene Park, who had handled the original purchase of my house back in 1994, and who I had stayed loosely in touch with over the decades since, mostly through the occasional holiday card and a shared membership at the same fishing club. Eugene agreed to meet me at a diner near the motel within the hour, and I watched his expression shift from casual friendliness to genuine alarm as he read through the paperwork I'd spread across the table between us. He had aged considerably since I'd last seen him in person, silver-haired and slightly stooped now, but his eyes still carried the same sharp, careful attentiveness I remembered from decades of watching him review real estate contracts line by line. "Walter, this is textbook property fraud," he told me, tapping the power of attorney document with 2 fingers. "Someone forged this signature, notarized it fraudulently, and used it to execute a sale you never agreed to. This kind of scheme usually targets elderly homeowners, specifically because county recording offices process these transfers with minimal scrutiny, unless someone actively flags a problem. He paused, studying my face carefully. Walter, I have to ask you directly, do you have any reason to believe someone in your own family might be involved in this? I thought about Brian's strange, evasive explanation in the driveway that morning, about Melissa's laughter echoing across the street, and I told Eugene, as calmly as I could manage, that I suspected exactly that, though I had no proof yet, beyond a father's uneasy instinct. Eugene sat back in the diner booth, quiet for a long moment, before telling me that, in his 30 years handling real estate law, family-involved fraud cases were almost always the hardest ones to prosecute successfully. Not because the evidence was harder to find, but because victims so often hesitated to pursue full accountability against their own children. I need you to decide right now, before we go any further, he told me, whether you're prepared to see this through completely, wherever it leads, even if it leads somewhere you don't want it to. I told him I was. Eugene recommended I bring in someone with financial forensics experience, someone who could trace the money and the paperwork trail with more precision than his own retired legal practice could provide. And he gave me the number of a woman named Denise Alvarado, a retired financial crimes investigator who had spent 20 years with the State Attorney General's office before opening her own consulting practice specializing in elder fraud cases. Denise met with me 2 days later, in a small conference room at Eugene's old office building that he still had informal access to, and I walked her through everything: the eviction paperwork, the forged power of attorney, Brian's evasive explanation, Melissa's laughter, the strange vagueness that had always surrounded her career whenever I'd asked about it over the years. Denise was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, dressed simply, with the particular economical manner of speech I recognized from decades of working alongside detectives and investigators during my own career. She listened without interruption, taking careful notes in a leather-bound notebook, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair with an expression I recognized immediately from my own decades of experience reading a room during a crisis. The particular focus of someone who has just heard something they know exactly how to investigate. Mr. Hayes, elder property fraud schemes like this rarely operate as isolated incidents, she told me. If someone forged a power of attorney and routed your property through a shell company below market value, that's not a one-time crime of opportunity. That's infrastructure. Someone built a system for doing this, and if they built a system, there are almost certainly other victims. I remember the particular chill of hearing that, the realization that whatever had happened to me might be only one piece of something considerably larger and more organized than a single family betrayal. I've seen this pattern before, she continued. Usually it starts small, 1 or 2 properties, testing whether anyone notices. When nobody does, it scales. Given how sophisticated this particular transfer was, I'd guess we're looking at something that's been running for a while. Denise began her investigation by pulling the corporate registration records for Meridian Property Holdings, tracing the company back to its listed registered agent, a small filing service downtown that, according to public records, had processed the incorporation paperwork for over 30 different shell companies over the preceding 2 years, an unusually high volume for a filing service of that size. She spent the better part of 2 weeks working through county records across 3 neighboring counties, building a spreadsheet that grew more alarming with each new entry, cross-referencing county property records against those 30 shell companies, and finding a disturbing pattern: 11 separate properties across 3 counties, all previously owned outright by homeowners over the age of 70, all transferred within the past 18 months through similarly structured power of attorney documents, all sold well below market value to companies that, upon closer inspection, seemed to exist solely on paper. I remember sitting across from Denise in Eugene's conference room as she walked me through that spreadsheet, watching the pattern emerge, property by property, name by name, each row representing another elderly person who had woken up one morning, just as I had, to find their entire life quietly stolen from beneath them. 2 of the 11 names, Denise noted quietly, belonged to homeowners who, according to public obituary records, had passed away in the months following their fraudulent eviction, their families left to untangle the mess, without ever fully understanding what had actually happened. "This isn't opportunistic," Denise told me, her voice carrying a controlled anger I recognized because I felt the same thing rising in my own chest. "This is a business model. Someone built a pipeline specifically designed to exploit people exactly like you, Mr. Hayes. People who worked their whole lives to own something outright, precisely because that ownership makes you a target rather than protecting you." The financial trail eventually led back to a woman named Kimberly Draper, Melissa's older sister, listed as the registered agent for Meridian Property Holdings. And, Denise discovered through careful review of banking records, obtained through a subpoena, Eugene helped expedite through an old contact still working at the county prosecutor's office, the primary signatory on accounts receiving the proceeds from all 11 fraudulent property transfers. Kimberly, it turned out, had built a small but sophisticated operation specifically targeting elderly homeowners, often relatives or acquaintances of trusted family members, who could provide insider information about a target's routine, financial situation, and likelihood of noticing irregularities before a transfer could be finalized and recorded. Melissa's role in the scheme, Denise's investigation revealed over the following weeks, had been considerably more direct than I initially suspected. Text messages recovered through a forensic review of a laptop Melissa had, carelessly, allowed Brian to use for his own work projects, revealed a pattern of communication between Melissa and her sister, spanning nearly a year, detailing my daily routine, my medication schedule, the fact that I lived alone since Carol's death, and rarely had visitors who might notice paperwork arriving that shouldn't have been arriving at all. One message, dated nearly 5 months before the eviction, read simply, "He's an easy target, Kim. Nobody checks on him. Brian barely calls him. We just need the signature, and the rest takes care of itself." Reading that message for the first time, printed and laid across Eugene's conference table, remains one of the more painful moments of the entire ordeal. Not because of the scheme itself, but because of the casual, business-like way my own daughter-in-law had cataloged my isolation as simply a useful operational detail. Brian's involvement, however, told a somewhat different and considerably more complicated story, once Denise and Eugene finished piecing together the full timeline. Recovered messages showed Brian expressing repeated hesitation about signing documents Melissa had presented to him as routine refinancing paperwork related to consolidating his own credit card debt, documents that, buried among legitimate-looking financial forms, had apparently included a signature authorization Melissa told him was simply a formality related to a family trust restructuring she claimed her sister was helping arrange. "I don't love signing stuff without Dad seeing it first," one message from Brian read. "It's just paperwork, babe. Don't overthink it," Melissa had responded. "Your dad trusts us. This makes everything easier for everyone." Brian, it appeared, had signed several documents without fully understanding their true purpose, pressured by a wife who had spent months carefully managing exactly how much information he had access to. Denise, reviewing this particular thread of messages, offered an observation that stuck with me for weeks afterward. "This is actually a fairly common pattern in these schemes," she told me. "The perpetrator doesn't just target the elderly homeowner directly. They target the family member closest to that homeowner first, isolating them just enough, managing their understanding of events just carefully enough, that by the time the fraud is complete, that family member has become an unwitting accomplice, without ever fully grasping what they participated in. Your son may genuinely believe, even now, that he did nothing seriously wrong." I sat with this discovery for several difficult days. The particular grief of understanding that my son had been manipulated rather than malicious, tangled together with anger, that he had been careless enough, distant enough from his own father, to sign documents affecting my life, without ever once picking up the phone to ask me directly what was actually happening. Carol would have known immediately something was wrong. I found myself thinking more than once during those days. She always saw people more clearly than I did, and I wondered, with a particular ache, whether Brian's distance from both of us over the years had left him vulnerable to exactly this kind of manipulation, isolated enough from his own family that a determined, patient predator like Melissa could reshape his understanding of loyalty entirely. I chose, deliberately, to say nothing to either Brian or Melissa during the weeks Denise and Eugene continued building the case. I remained at the motel, then eventually moved into a small extended stay apartment closer to town, once it became clear the investigation would take considerably longer than I'd initially hoped. And I let Brian believe, through the handful of stilted phone calls he made checking in on me, that I remained confused and defeated, an old man simply trying to process an incomprehensible loss. "Dad, I'm going to fix this, I promise," he told me during one particularly awkward call. "Melissa's been talking to a lawyer about it. We'll figure something out." I thanked him, kept my voice carefully neutral, and said nothing about the growing folder of evidence sitting in Eugene's office, documenting exactly how deliberate this misunderstanding had actually been. Those calls with Brian during that waiting period were, in some ways, among the hardest parts of the entire ordeal. He would call every 4 or 5 days, always brief, always slightly evasive, updating me on vague progress towards sorting things out, while never once offering the kind of direct, honest explanation I knew. By that point, he was incapable of giving, because he genuinely didn't understand the full scope of what Melissa had actually done. I remember one call in particular, nearly a month into the investigation, when Brian's voice cracked slightly as he told me, "Dad, I know I haven't been the son I should have been the last few years. I keep thinking about that, especially now, with everything going on. I'm sorry." I told him honestly that I appreciated him saying that, and I meant it, even as I sat in a small apartment surrounded by evidence proving his wife had orchestrated the theft of my home, using information he had, unwittingly, made available to her. I also, during those weeks, found myself thinking often about the extended stay apartment itself, a modest, forgettable space, entirely unlike the home Carol and I had built together, and I remember the particular loneliness of those evenings, sitting alone with takeout containers and case files spread across a small kitchenette table, no photographs on the walls, no familiar creak of floorboards, nothing that felt like mine. I understood during those weeks something about displacement I had never fully appreciated, even after decades of helping families who'd lost their homes to fire. The particular disorientation of simply not having a place that belongs to you. A feeling I had always assumed I understood professionally, but had never actually experienced myself until that autumn. Denise's investigation eventually connected Kimberly Draper's shell company scheme to 2 additional accomplices. A notary named Gordon Blake, whose credentials had been used to fraudulently authenticate the forged power of attorney documents across all 11 fraudulent property transfers, and a county records clerk named Patricia Wynn, who, for a steady stream of cash payments, had quietly expedited the processing of the fraudulent transfers, ensuring they cleared county review with minimal scrutiny before any red flags could be raised. Denise tracked down Gordon Blake first, locating him through his still-active notary license, a nervous, heavy-set man in his 50s who, once confronted with the mounting evidence during a carefully arranged meeting, Denise coordinated with an old contact at the county prosecutor's office, admitted almost immediately to his role, explaining that Kimberly had approached him nearly 2 years earlier with what she'd framed as a simple, victimless way to supplement his modest notary income. "She told me these were just difficult family situations," Gordon told the investigators, according to the summary Denise later shared with me. "Elderly people whose families needed to handle things quickly because of dementia or incapacity, that kind of thing. I know that sounds naive now. I told myself I was helping families avoid complicated guardianship proceedings." Whether Gordon genuinely believed that framing at the outset, or simply found it convenient to believe, Denise noted, was ultimately irrelevant to the legal exposure he now faced, though his cooperation in identifying Patricia Wynn and providing detailed records of his interactions with Kimberly proved invaluable in building the broader case. Patricia Wynn's involvement, once uncovered, painted an even more troubling picture of how deeply the scheme had penetrated the very systems meant to protect homeowners like me. As a records clerk with nearly 15 years at the county office, Patricia had unique visibility into which property transfers were likely to draw scrutiny and which could be quietly expedited without triggering the kind of manual review that might have caught the fraudulent power of attorney documents before they were ever finalized. Denise's financial forensics traced nearly $40,000 in cash payments to Patricia over the 18-month span of the scheme. Payments carefully structured to avoid triggering her own bank's suspicious activity reporting requirements. The same kind of financial sophistication that made the entire operation so difficult to detect until someone, in this case me, refused to simply accept the loss and walk away. The full scope of the operation, once Denise's forensic accounting work was complete, after nearly 6 weeks of painstaking effort, revealed over $2 million in property value, stolen from 11 elderly homeowners across 3 counties. I remember Denise walking me through the full list, one final time before we moved toward confronting Brian and Melissa directly, reading off names I didn't recognize, ages ranging from 72 to 89, properties in towns I'd driven through countless times over the years, without ever imagining the quiet devastation happening behind ordinary front doors. 2 of those 11 homeowners, Denise told me again, her voice carrying a weight I recognized from my own years of delivering difficult news to families, had already passed away in the months since losing their homes, never living to see any resolution or justice for what had been taken from them, their families left to untangle fraudulent paperwork on top of ordinary grief. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Hayes," Denise told me during one of our final planning sessions before the confrontation. "What you're about to do isn't just about getting your own house back. The moment this becomes public and prosecutable, it becomes evidence for 10 other families who deserve the same resolution you're about to get. You're not just fighting for yourself here." I thought about that often in the days leading up to the celebration at Brian and Melissa's new house. The particular weight of understanding that whatever I did next carried consequences far beyond my own front door. 6 weeks after I was evicted from my own home in front of a filming, laughing daughter-in-law, Brian and Melissa announced, through a group family text message that felt almost surreally casual given everything that had happened, a celebration for their new home purchase, a considerably larger house across town, that Melissa had apparently insisted on buying almost immediately after the eviction, using, Denise's financial trail confirmed, a portion of the proceeds from my own stolen property. The invitation included a note from Brian that read, "Dad, I know things have been rough, but we'd really love for you to come. It would mean a lot to both of us." I told him I would be there. In the days leading up to the celebration, Denise and Eugene helped me plan the confrontation, with the same careful precision I remembered applying to coordinating a complex multi-unit response during my career, walking through contingencies, timing, exactly how and when law enforcement would enter once the evidence had been presented. Denise had, by that point, developed a working relationship with a detective in the county's newly formed property fraud unit, a sharp, methodical woman named Detective Renata Ford, who had been independently investigating suspicious property transfer patterns in the area for several months, and who, upon reviewing Denise's findings, recognized immediately how significant the case had become. Detective Ford agreed to have her team positioned nearby on the evening of the celebration, ready to move the moment I gave the signal, much the same way I had once coordinated backup units waiting just out of sight during a delicate rescue operation. On the evening of the celebration, I arrived at the new house wearing the same charcoal suit I had worn to Carol's funeral, carrying nothing but a small flash drive in my jacket pocket, watching nearly 40 guests mingle through rooms furnished with an obvious, deliberate extravagance that struck me, walking through it, as almost grotesque given exactly where the money for it had come from. The house itself was easily twice the size of my own home on Larkspur Lane, all sharp modern angles and expensive finishes, and I found myself, walking through the entryway, thinking about how Carol would have hated it, how she'd always preferred warmth and character over the kind of sterile showroom perfection Melissa had clearly aimed for. Melissa greeted me at the door with a hug that felt as hollow and performative as everything else about her, telling me how glad she was that I had decided to move past everything and be part of their new beginning. I thanked her, kept my expression carefully neutral, and made my way toward the back of the large open living room where Brian was preparing to give a brief toast to the assembled guests, catching a glimpse of Kimberly Draper near the kitchen island, laughing with a small group of guests, entirely unaware of exactly how thoroughly her operation had already been unraveled by that point. "I just want to say," Brian began, raising a glass of champagne, "this has been a tough year for our family, but we're really grateful for everyone who's supported us, especially my dad, who's here tonight, and who I think has really come around to understanding this was all just a difficult transition." He gestured toward me, smiling, clearly hoping the moment would read to the room as a touching display of reconciliation. Several guests turned to look at me expectantly, the same warm, encouraging applause beginning to build that people offer when they believe they're witnessing a genuine family healing. A scattering of soft, awe sounds rippling through the room as people raise their own glasses in my direction. I set down my untouched glass of champagne on a nearby table and walked toward the front of the room, toward the large television mounted above the fireplace that had been playing a slideshow of Brian and Melissa's recent vacation photos, a beach somewhere, both of them smiling in matching sunglasses, funded, I now understood clearly, by money, stolen from families, exactly like my own. I took the flash drive from my jacket pocket and handed it to a young man I recognized as a technician Denise had arranged to have present, under the guise of handling the party's audio-visual equipment. And within moments, the vacation slideshow disappeared, replaced by a scanned image of the forged power of attorney document, magnified large enough for every guest in the room to see clearly. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," I said, my voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet room. The same measured, steady tone I had used for 4 decades commanding firefighters through the chaos of active emergencies. Because I think it's important that everyone understands exactly how this house, and the house I raised my son in, came to be sold. I walked the room through the evidence methodically. The forged signature magnified beside a genuine sample of my own handwriting. The shell company registration documents tracing back to Melissa's sister. The recovered text messages detailing months of careful planning around my routine and isolation. The financial trail showing exactly how the proceeds from my stolen home had funded the very house we were standing in. I played, through the room's sound system, a portion of a recorded phone call Denise had obtained through a subpoena. Kimberly Draper's voice unmistakable, discussing the scheme's mechanics with a casual, business-like cruelty that made several guests visibly recoil. In the recording, Kimberly could be heard explaining to an associate how she selected targets specifically based on isolation and routine predictability, describing elderly homeowners in the same detached, transactional language a person might use, discussing inventory rather than human beings who had spent decades building lives in the homes she was systematically stealing. "The key," her recorded voice said, "is finding the ones nobody's checking on. Grief does half the work for you. Once somebody's alone, they're not paying attention the way they used to." Hearing those words play through the speakers of a house purchased with stolen money, in front of nearly 40 guests who had arrived, expecting nothing more than champagne and celebration, created a silence in that room I don't think I will ever fully forget. Melissa's face, I noticed, had gone entirely rigid. Her earlier performative warmth collapsed into something closer to panic as she looked toward the door, toward her sister standing near the kitchen, some silent, desperate communication passing between them. I watched Kimberly's expression shift as she recognized her own recorded voice. The practiced confidence she'd carried into that party evaporating within seconds, replaced by the particular scrambling panic of someone realizing, all at once, that months of careful planning had just been unraveled in a single evening. Brian stood frozen beside me, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand, his expression shifting through disbelief, horror, and finally, as the full scope of the evidence became undeniable, a devastating, dawning understanding of exactly how thoroughly he had been used. I watched him look at Melissa, searching her face for some explanation, some denial, and finding instead only the same rigid, cornered panic that had overtaken Kimberly moments earlier. And precisely as I finished laying out the final piece of evidence, the front door opened, and Detective Renata Ford's team from the county's property fraud unit walked in alongside 2 uniformed officers, their credentials visible, their expressions entirely professional, moving directly toward Kimberly Draper and the notary, Gordon Blake, who I hadn't even realized was present among the guests until that exact moment. Standing near the drink table with a nervous, unsettled expression, I now understood, in an entirely different light. Kimberly did not resist, though she shouted something at Melissa I didn't fully catch as officers guided her toward the door. Something about promises broken and blame not landing where it belonged. Melissa herself was taken into custody moments later, her earlier laughter from that morning on Larkspur Lane replaced entirely by a silence that seemed to swallow the whole room. Brian turned to me, his face pale, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I swear to you, I didn't understand what those documents actually were, I thought." I held up a hand, gently, and told him I believed him, that Denise's investigation had already shown clearly how carefully Melissa had managed exactly what he was allowed to understand, but that believing him did not erase the fact that he had signed away his own father's home without ever once picking up the phone to ask a single direct question. "I need you to understand something, Brian," I told him, my voice quiet enough that only he could hear it over the chaos of the room around us. "I love you. I have never once stopped loving you, not for a single day since you were born. But love and trust are not the same thing, and you are going to have to work, seriously and honestly, to rebuild the second one." In the months that followed, Melissa's sister Kimberly was charged with organizing a criminal enterprise specifically targeting elderly homeowners, facing multiple counts of forgery, fraud, and grand theft across 3 counties, charges that, given the scale of the operation and the number of victims involved, carried the possibility of a sentence that would keep her incarcerated for the majority of her remaining working life. Detective Ford's team, working alongside Denise's already thorough documentation, moved quickly to secure the remaining assets tied to Meridian Property Holdings and its associated shell companies, freezing accounts before Kimberly or her associates could attempt to move or hide the remaining proceeds. The notary, Gordon Blake, and the county clerk, Patricia Nguyen, both eventually cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, providing testimony that helped Denise and the county's fraud unit recover, over the following year, nearly the full value of the properties stolen from all 11 victims, including, mercifully, restitution processes established for the families of victims who had passed away before seeing justice served. I attended, at Denise's invitation, a small gathering the county's Victim Services Office organized for the surviving homeowners and families several months after the arrests, and I remember sitting in a community center meeting room with 8 other people who had experienced almost exactly what I had, listening to their stories, recognizing in each one some version of the same disorientation and grief I had carried myself, and feeling, for the first time since that morning on Larkspur Lane, a strange, unexpected sense of solidarity and shared survival. Melissa faced her own separate charges for her direct role in identifying and facilitating my specific case, ultimately accepting a plea agreement that included several years of incarceration, along with mandatory restitution, and the marriage between her and Brian, unsurprisingly, did not survive what followed, with Brian filing for divorce within 3 months of that evening, once the full extent of how deliberately he had been isolated from his own father finally, fully sank in. I did not push him toward that decision, though I will admit, I was relieved when he made it on his own, understanding that whatever genuine feelings he'd once had for Melissa, the relationship had been built, from very early on a foundation of careful, deliberate deception he was only beginning to fully reckon with. My house on Larkspur Lane was formally returned to my ownership through a county court order, roughly 4 months after that celebration, the fraudulent transfer nullified entirely once the evidence Denise and Eugene had assembled was presented before a judge. I remember walking back through that front door for the first time since the eviction, standing in the quiet living room where Carol and I had raised Brian, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease, the particular unease of a man who understands that a house, however legally secured, can never again feel as unshakably safe as it did before someone he trusted proved capable of taking it from him. The house smelled faintly musty from months of sitting empty, and I spent the better part of a weekend simply airing out rooms, washing windows, doing small, ordinary maintenance tasks that felt, in their own quiet way, like a form of reclaiming something more than just physical property. Brian and I have spent the past several months slowly, carefully rebuilding something between us. Not the easy, uncomplicated relationship of his childhood, but something more deliberate, built on the kind of honest, difficult conversations we should have been having for years before any of this happened. He calls every week now, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask my advice about decisions he's making. Small, ordinary things that nonetheless represent a genuine shift in how present he's choosing to be in my life. He has also, at his own initiative, begun seeing a therapist, something I know he would have dismissed years earlier, working through both the immediate trauma of discovering how thoroughly he'd been manipulated and the longer, deeper patterns of conflict avoidance that had made him vulnerable to that manipulation in the first place. I told him, during one of those calls, that forgiveness would take time, that I was not interested in pretending the last year hadn't happened simply to make either of us feel more comfortable, but that I did believe, given real effort and real accountability, we could eventually rebuild something worth having. I need you to actually show me, Brian, not just tell me, I said. Actions. Over time. That's the only thing that rebuilds trust once it's been broken this badly. He agreed. And in the months since, I have watched him make good, consistently, on that agreement. Small deposits of reliability and honesty, accumulating slowly into something I am cautiously beginning to trust again. I still sit sometimes on my own front porch on Larkspur Lane in the evenings. The same porch where Carol and I used to watch Brian ride his bicycle up and down the street as a boy. And I think about how close I came to losing this house entirely, to spending whatever years I have left in a small apartment somewhere, quietly displaced by people I trusted enough to never once suspect. A house I have come to understand more deeply than I ever did before that morning is not simply walls and a roof and 30 years of mortgage payments finally paid off. It is trust, given freely and maintained carefully, the kind of foundation that can be undermined far more easily than any of us like to believe, and rebuilt only through the slow, patient work of proving, day after day, that it deserves to stand again. I think often about the other 10 families. Denise's investigation eventually helped. About the particular satisfaction of knowing that my own refusal to simply accept an incomprehensible loss and move on had, in some small way, protected people I will likely never meet from continuing to lose everything to a scheme built specifically to exploit exactly the kind of quiet, trusting vulnerability that comes with growing older alone. 40 years running toward other people's emergencies taught me something I don't think I ever articulated clearly until this happened to me directly. That the instinct to help doesn't retire just because the uniform does. That the discipline of staying calm, gathering facts, and acting deliberately rather than reactively applies just as powerfully to a stolen house as it ever did to a burning building. I have also, in the months since, become something of an informal resource for a few of the other victims from that gathering the county organized, fielding occasional phone calls from people navigating their own recovery process, offering the kind of steady, practical reassurance I spent 4 decades learning how to provide during genuine emergencies. There is a particular kind of purpose in that, I've found, a way of taking something that was done to me and turning it, deliberately, into something that might make the next person's path slightly easier to walk. A house is not made of walls alone. What actually protects it, what actually makes it worth defending, is the truth that holds it together, and the people willing to trust each other enough to keep that truth intact. That, I have come to believe, is the real lesson this entire ordeal taught me, more valuable, in its own strange way, than the house itself. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe truth and trust are the real foundation of any home, hit subscribe to Humble Dad Stories. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you.